79 years ago, a country struggled to manufacture even many basic modern medicines. It imported from across the world and its people could not afford basic healthcare. Now, cut to 2026. The same country is today the third largest producer of pharmaceuticals in the world by volume. It supplies around 20% of the world's generic medicines, exports pharmaceuticals to almost 200 countries, and has become one of the world's most important suppliers of affordable drugs and vaccines. This is India. Welcome to episode 2 of the India Advantage. Today, we will tell you a story, a tale of how a country that once depended on imported medicines itself is now known as the pharmacy of the world, which is the second greatest strength of our country, India. When India became independent in 1947, its pharmaceutical industry was small and heavily dependent on foreign companies and imports. Domestic manufacturing capacity was limited, and multinational companies occupied an important position in the Indian pharmaceutical market. So, India faced a fundamental question: would it continue depending heavily on imported medicines and foreign manufacturers, or could it build its own pharmaceutical industry? And guess which path India took? The difficult one. It wanted to build everything at home. And one important early step came in 1954 when the government established Hindustan Antibiotics Limited in Pune. It became India's first public sector undertaking in the drugs and pharmaceutical sector and the first Indian drug manufacturing unit to commercially produce antibiotics such as penicillin and streptomycin. But manufacturing medicines was only one part of the problem. For a low income country with hundreds of millions of people, medicines also had to be affordable. And this is where one decision fundamentally altered the trajectory of Indian pharma. In 1970, India introduced a new Patents Act. Under the system that followed, pharmaceutical products themselves did not receive product patent protection in India in a way that they did in other markets. Pharmaceutical manufacturing process, however, could receive limited patent protection. That distinction was important. This is what it means. Indian scientists could legally develop alternative processes to manufacture medicines whose products were patented elsewhere. The World Health Organization, or WHO, says Indian scientists learn to reverse engineer pharmaceutical compounds while domestic entrepreneurs built factories, refined manufacturing technology, and produced increasingly large volumes. Competition increased, manufacturing capacity improved, and India developed one of the world's most formidable generic drug industries. And perhaps nowhere was the importance of that capability more visible than during global HIV/AIDS crisis. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, effective antiretroviral treatment existed, but for millions of people in poor countries, the price made treatment practically inaccessible. Then, Indian generic manufacturers entered the picture. In 2001, Indian pharmaceutical company Cipla famously offered a triple combination HIV therapy to humanitarian organizations at roughly $350 per patient per year. That is less than $1 per day. The offer was dramatically below the prevailing prices of branded treatment. And as generic competition expanded, the economics of treating HIV changed. India became one of the central suppliers of affordable antiretroviral drugs to developing nations. That became the model for India's pharmaceutical advantage, not necessarily inventing every original drug, but becoming exceptionally good at producing high volume medicines efficiently and affordably. And that advantage expanded far beyond HIV. Indian companies became major suppliers of medicines used for tuberculosis, malaria, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and numerous other conditions. But that patent regime we talked about did not remain unchanged forever. As part of India's obligations under WTO's TRIPS agreement, India amended its patent law from 2005 and restored product patent protection for pharmaceuticals. So, India's pharmaceutical advantage today isn't simply the result of copying patented medicines. It's modern generic industry operating within a very different international patient framework today. But by the time that transition actually happened, India had already built something extremely valuable. Decades of expertise in chemistry, process engineering, and low cost pharmaceutical manufacturing. Today, the Indian government estimates that India supplies around 20% of global generic medicines. And you can see the economics of generics inside India as well. Through the government's Jan Aushadhi program, generic medicines are sold through dedicated outlets across the country. As of February 2026, India had 18,646 Jan Aushadhi Kendras. According to the Department of Pharmaceuticals, medicines sold through these centers are generally around 50 to 80% cheaper than the branded medicines. In fact, the government estimates that lower prices through the program have generated around 40,000 crore rupees in savings for consumers over the past 11 years. And this is important. India's advantage isn't simply about making cheap drugs. It is about competition, scale, chemistry expertise, manufacturing efficiency, and an enormous domestic market. But India's pharmaceutical story isn't limited to tablets because India also became a global vaccine manufacturing powerhouse. And the numbers here are extraordinary. According to the Indian government, Indian manufacturers supply around 60% of vaccines procured by UNICEF. India meets roughly 40 to 70% of global demand for DPT and BCG vaccines and around 90% of WHO's demand for measles vaccines. Then came the ultimate stress test, COVID-19. Suddenly, the entire world needed billions of vaccine doses. India developed Covaxin, an indigenous COVID-19 vaccine developed by Bharat Biotech in collaboration with the Indian Council of Medical Research and the National Institute of Virology. Meanwhile, the Serum Institute of India manufactured Covishield based on Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And India didn't manufacture vaccines just for itself. Through Vaccine Maitri and other export channels, Indian made COVID vaccines were supplied internationally through grants, commercial contracts, and the COVAX initiative. COVID demonstrated why manufacturing capacity itself had become a strategic asset. When the world desperately needed billions of doses, India had factories capable of producing them at enormous scale. But COVID also highlighted a weakness in India's pharmaceutical model. India can manufacture enormous quantities of finished medicines, but it still depends heavily on imports for many of the ingredients used to make them. These are active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs, along with key starting materials and drug intermediates. Think of API as the substance responsible for medicine's therapeutic effect. And here, India's dependence on China is significant. In FY25, India imported about $4.35 billion worth of APIs, bulk drugs, and drug intermediates across the government's measured categories. China accounted for approximately 73.7% of that import value. That is an important vulnerability because a country can dominate finished drug manufacturing while still depending on another country for critical inputs. So, India is now trying to rebuild more of that supply chain domestically. Through the production linked initiative scheme for bulk drugs, the government says that approximately 56,800 tons of annual domestic manufacturing capacity has already been established across 28 of 41 identical critical products. So the next question isn't can India manufacture medicines cheaply? It's can India control more of the pharmaceutical value chain? And that question becomes even more important because the pharmaceutical industry itself is changing. The future isn't just conventional drug tablets anymore. It's biologics, biosimilars, complex injectables, advanced vaccines, cell and gene therapy, and AI assisted drug recovery. And this is where India's next challenge begins. India's first pharmaceutical revolution was largely built around manufacturing and generics. The next one needs much more innovation. In 2024, India approved the Bio E3 policy, biotechnology for economy, environment, and employment, aimed at expanding advanced biomanufacturing and developing infrastructure such as bio AI hubs and biofoundries. And in 2026-27 budget, the government went further. It announced Biopharma Shakti with an outlay of 10,000 crore rupees over 5 years, aimed at strengthening India's capabilities in biologics and biosimilars. Because there is a huge difference between being the world's factory for existing medicines and becoming a country that discovers the world's next blockbuster drug. There is also another one thing that India cannot afford to compromise on: quality. India's pharmaceutical advantage depends not just on price but also on trust. The industry has faced serious international scrutiny after cases involving substandard or contaminated medicines. And for a country supplying medicines to patients around the world, maintaining rigorous manufacturing and regulatory standards is essential. Cheap medicine without consistent quality isn't an advantage. So, India's challenge is to maintain all three: affordability, scale, and quality. Now, look at the economics of what India has built. In 2000 to 2001, India's pharmaceutical exports were worth just $1.9 billion. By FY25, they reached $30.47 billion. That's an increase of almost 16 times. India exported pharmaceuticals to 191 countries in FY25. In fact, the United States alone accounts for roughly 34% of India's pharmaceutical exports, while Europe accounts for around 19%. India's domestic pharmaceutical market is also estimated at roughly $60 billion, with government projections putting it at $130 billion approximately by 2030. So, India isn't simply the pharmacy of poorer countries anymore. It has become deeply integrated into the healthcare supply chains of some of the richest economies in the world, too. But India's next pharmaceutical revolution will have to be different. The first one was about self reliance, then came affordability, then scale, then the next one has to be about innovation. Because India's ultimate pharmaceutical advantage shouldn't simply be its ability to manufacture the world's medicines. It should be its ability to discover the world's next medicines, manufacture them at scale, and make sure that the world can afford them.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.